We ready? Rolling. My name is Jim, you know that. I'm the librarian archivist here. So I take care of all of the two-dimensional stuff. Maps, papers, photographs, books, that sort of thing. What I'm going to show to you today is our collection of the 77th Regiment during the Civil War, which was raised in Saratoga County. So if you want to come over here, these are the stuff we have. I'll go over this first, what we have, and the second one's on the internet. First of all, we have a photograph collection. We have about 2,000 or 3,000. It's hard to quantify. Civil War photographs. They're called CDB. The small ones are called CDBs, carte de visite. It was the first mass-produced photograph. Started in the late 1850s. It was the first photograph that people could actually afford. So a lot of people use them as calling cards. I think that's where the French word comes from. What we've done is we shipped all of our CDVs down to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, to the Center for Military History. What they did is they scanned them all in and gave us reproductions and the originals back. They're part of that deal. What they got was they got to keep copies. And it was nice because they also identified a lot of the people. If you look real closely, you see holes in the original. That's where they were hung up on the Capitol Museum for a lot of years after the Civil War. They thankfully took them down at some point because people were just taking them. I've heard estimates that at one point our collection was about 10,000. Now we're down to less than 4. In addition to the CDVs, we also have quite a few large photographs. Okay, so that's the photographs. The next thing of interest is the unit roster. This came out after the Civil War. This was published probably 1901, probably. This takes into account the 75th, 76th, 77th, 78th, all the way up to the 80th regiments. This is great for people with ancestors in the Civil War. For instance, this guy is William A. DeLong. So we can read about DeLong, D-E, wrong page. Do you see him?
Right there?
Yeah. So we can read about William DeLong as well as we have the photograph. Some people are bummed to learn that their ancestors deserted. But desertion back then isn't the same as now because a lot of people went home to pull in their crops and then re-enlisted in another unit. In fact, a couple people have come in. Our book says they've deserted, but the National Archives has records that they received a pension. So what you find is a lot of people are under 2 different names for 2 different regiments. They're under 2 different names in the same regiment. There's a lot of misinformation that you have to sort of sift through.
As with immigration, things just aren't as they reported.
Yes.
It's just, they didn't have the technology.
Right. So we have the roster, the photographs. Our next big thing is our Civil War newspaper clipping file. What happened during the Civil War is an organization called the Bureau of Military Statistics subscribed to all the newspapers throughout the state and clipped articles on each different unit and then pasted them on paper like this. So they eventually had a pretty substantial thing on a lot of units. This is 77th. we have probably about 80% of the units have at least one page of newspaper clippings. Right now we're in the process of scanning these into the computer and making them, putting them up on the web. That's a lot of work because, as you can see by the size of this text, it's very difficult for the computer to read text that small. So we have to go through it twice, basically proofreading. Once with a product called Abby Fine Reader, and then once with Microsoft Word. And even then we don't catch all the mistakes. So those are basically our collections. What else I have up here are things we received from other institutions. This is originally a newspaper clipping file from a scrapbook that somebody donated to the Saratoga Public Library, their local history room. This is a letter that goes along with that. So we saw that they had that and asked them for a copy. And we've also asked for things on microfilm so we can have them in our collection as well. And that's why I have all the different copies. Because a lot of these things are no longer print. So the best you can do is microfilm, print it out, and have it that way. And then we have some miscellaneous things. Here's an article that appeared in the Civil War, America's Civil War, and some miscellaneous enlistment papers. Look through those if you want. But yep.
If I could ask, you always see these military kind of photographs. What is it? Family who would take these, or the person himself would just have the military photo taken?
This one actually has a photographer on the back. I got the feeling I think they're a lot like school pictures, where a professional would go around, take their picture. Yeah.
Because today, people, military people have full dress.
Because from my understanding, the process was inexpensive, but the equipment was not. So this wasn't something the ordinary family could afford. Okay. So the next thing we have, I have a handout.
Thank you.
Oh, sure. The front is just our Civil War History Project homepage. The back is how to get to it. Okay? So, like I said, to get to it, you can either type in the URL up here, or go to Google. I'm not connected to the internet right now. And search for the New York State Military History Museum, or Military Museum, and you'll get to our homepage. Then you just click on the Unit History Project, and then just choose Civil War. Then once you're at this page, you can either choose a specific type of unit, artillery, cavalry, infantry, others, engineer, and sharpshooters. The 77th is an infantry unit, so to get to that, you'd click on infantry. Or you can choose a resource. A good local history resource is the communities of New York in the Civil War. This is a list put together by Dornbush. Dornbush is a pretty well-known Civil War bibliographer. He has a 4-volume set that was just reprinted, where he breaks down which articles and books and pieces of information go with which unit through every state in the North and every state in the South. He also put together this list, and because of formatting purposes, it doesn't flow very good. But so you click on Saratoga County, and these are all the different units that were raised in Saratoga County. So for Saratoga Springs, where are you from?
Saratoga.
Okay,
yeah.
Saratoga Springs, okay. You see that we raised artillery. The 13th Regiment, Company E, was raised in Saratoga. Cavalry, the 2nd Veteran Companies C, D, F, G, I to L. Then, God, I can't see that. that better? Would you like it bigger?
No, it's fine.
Okay, because and then infantry. You see that 2nd Regiment Company C was raised here, then 77th Company C through G and K, then 115th. And to find out more information about any of these, you can just click on them. And this is our 77th homepage. What you have here is you have when they were mustered in, when they were mustered out, a short history. This was scanned in from Pfisterer's, New York in the War of the Rebellion. It's a 5-volume set that goes through every unit that was raised in New York. It lists all the officers with a brief bio for each officer. It lists where they were organized from and when their casualties. This table is also from Pfisterer. Right now, this is just an image due to state guidelines put out by the one state agency, I forget which one. We have to make this text accessible. So what we're doing is we're in the process of typing all this information in to an Excel spreadsheet, which we can then post on the internet. But for right now, it's just an image. That way, blind people or people with vision disabilities have access to it. And it lists all the different actions they were in, the dates, and how many people, their casualties, which is kind of nice. We've scanned in a couple photographs just to give you an idea of the dress in each regiment, although a lot of people are wearing their civilian clothes. But this is a list of all of our photographs from the 77th. Let me see, up here we have a link to their monument at Gettysburg, as well as the text that's on it below. There are 2 marked flags during the war that we have on the internet. Chris Morton, the gentleman before, he's in charge of the flags, so he and I work to coordinate this. And then a list of different resources. And we have all the ones in bold.
It's very comprehensive. It's a huge project. I mean, this is one regiment.
Yes, this is one regiment. Yeah, it's a big project. Yeah, it's a huge project.
It's going to be interesting.
It is interesting.
Sleuthing, finding.
Yeah. A lot of people who come in are driven, and it's interesting to watch.
Terrific. One side of my family has got a lot of, done a lot of genealogy, so we've gotten a lot of these pictures. We've gotten, documents of, somebody who's in charge of procuring all their materials, like the food and the clothing, and so we have all those documents, which were, he's sort of somebody perused and found and dug up, and it's fun. It's fun to see that connection.
That is fun. Yeah.
See where people are driven to, they get one document and they have to keep researching stuff. It's fun. Next, are we next with you? No.
We can adapt it to any grade level. Mike Russert and I, 2 of the people on the committee, were both middle school teachers, so I guess that's what we were thinking of, yes. This is the common soldier in the Civil War. What we try to do is have the kids have a museum visit in which there's a lot of hands-on materials involved. And basically, a group would come in and there'd be a scavenger hunt, and then there'd be a presentation by 3 people concentrating on the common soldier in the Revolution, World War II, and the Civil War. And we can adapt it to whatever they're studying at the time. And I basically do the common soldier in the Civil War. And what we've done is we've purchase these reproductions so that the kids can touch all this stuff. And basically, we try to explain the whole existence of the common soldier. We start out with why there was a Civil War, who was involved, and that it was a young person's war, and to talk about there were almost 400,000 New Yorkers in the Civil War, in the war in general, in the Union Army in general. There was 100,000 16-year-olds, and there were 300 that were 10 to 13, and 25 that were 10. And in doing so, we talk about this young man, Gustav Schumann, and he started out as a drummer boy and became a bugler, and has an interesting story. Became a friend of Tad Lincoln and got to visit the White House. Lincoln was going to sponsor him into West Point when he grew up, and why we concentrate on him is we have his uniform and his bugle in this case in here. So we're talking about someone that's the age of the students involved. We also have reproduction things for the Revolutionary War. These are just a couple out here. And World War II, we have so many World War II contributions that everything is original that we're using for World War II. It seems every week somebody comes in and says, like something from my father's things or my husband's things from World War II. Yes, so we have, this is all reproduction stuff. This is actual materials. I put together a slideshow of the common soldier. We've used that in the past. But basically we just talk about how they lived, and the fact they had a march, and kids get a kick out of what they ate, the hardtack, and what can happen to hardtack. Oh, that's gross. They really love that.
I'm sorry, you set up, prior to here, when you were in the education?
No, prior to being here, I was teaching music also. And just about the time this opened, they needed someone in the museum store, which I took that job. I just worked a couple days a week. But being here, I said we really should develop an education program, and we started doing that. And it's going. It's a continuous thing as we get more money to buy more things and this type of thing.
Interesting. These I find interesting, doing colonial occupations.
Yes.
Someone shooting.
In this particular war, they were about 8 years into a left and a right shoe. But tell the kids, try to imagine yourself walking on grass with these things. And they put these cleats on them and have them wear a little longer. But they're basically just a factory worker shoe that they adapted for the Army. As the war went on, did more and more cost cutting. This is the uniform at the beginning of the war. And this is a private sack coat as the war progressed. So they were really into saving money as much as they could. We always get the kids in these things. They complain how warm they are in this type of thing because they were wearing wool the whole season, all seasons. Yes, I will. These are just a couple of the handouts. We have handouts for each of the errors. And if you'd like your class to visit, that first sheet we have a telephone number, who to contact. Little things. When we talk about recognition and the cards and the no numbers on the cards. And, the fact that 13, 14-year-old girls in every community made these things called housewives, which were just needles and threads and buttons on every soldier, but that was their contribution. And things like that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
We don't very often hear about what women did, how they participated. The way I'm dressed, I'm a working woman. I could have been a laundress or a seamstress or a nurse, and I'm not wearing hoops or a corset these days, and so I could technically be called a loose woman. Toward the end of the war, women started to rethink the corset stay thing and realized that they could move around a lot better if they weren't so tightly bound. But right now, at the beginning of the war, I would be referred to as a loose woman. Some women participated in the war by actually joining armies on both sides. There were hundreds of women who disguised themselves as men and fought, and there were some women who even into the early 1900s, disguised themselves so well that no one knew they were women. I don't remember the name of the woman, but she was in an accident in the 1900s, and they discovered at that point she was a woman and not a man. So she very successfully disguised herself as a man.
They wanted to serve.
They wanted to serve. They felt so strongly about the cause on both sides that they decided they wanted to serve as soldiers. Some women were spies for one side or the other, or for both, pretending to be an agent for one and actually a spy for the other. And some of the New York regiments had young girls who went along. They were actually teenagers, and they were called bandages. And they were usually the daughters of some of the generals or lieutenants of the regiment. And they went along sort of like a mascot, and they wore a uniform that had pants and a short skirt, and they were kind of like the adopted daughters. So they participated not really in the battle, but they were right there in the front to nurse anybody that needed something and to take care of the soldiers. The women who stayed at home participated by joining ladies' aid societies, and you can see here they were very active in raising money for the troops. They had a number of plays, they had fairs just to raise money for the troops. They also knitted socks and mittens because those are very much needed by the soldiers. And as you can see, these are actually envelopes that are held by the New York Historical Society. These were envelopes that were printed during the Civil War, and if you'd like to look at these are not actual size. I've enlarged them a little bit. The actual size of the envelopes was 3 by 5. But you can see by reading the text what women were feeling about the war. That some of them felt very badly that they couldn't serve, so they were going to go and nurse. Or there's one picture of a woman who all the men have left, and she's wondering if they'll take her as well in the army. She doesn't have anybody left to support her at home. One of the things that women did to forget about the war was to read two very popular magazines during that time. One was Godey's, and one was Peterson's. And Peterson's and Godey's both were kind of like the Good Housekeeping or the Better Homes and Gardens of today. They had recipes, they had fashions. Women were very interested in the fashions at the time. They had ways of fixing their hair. Women were very interested in the European fashions, and so if you look at some of these recipes are kind of interesting.
Yeah, French roll.
Not only recipes for cooking, but recipes to keep your hair from falling out, recipes to keep your skin soft. Very interesting things. And then we have the hairstyles here. Some women accompanied their husbands. This lady went with her husband all during the war, and she wrote a book about her experiences. I did not print that off. If you'd be interested in reading that, I can print it off for you.
Did she actually travel to it?
Yes, she did.
Her husband? Officer.
And one of the things, Louisa May Alcott, I didn't realize, was a nurse during the Civil War. And she wrote a book called Hospital Sketches about her experiences. And this is here, and the whole thing is available on the internet. If you just put in Google or Yahoo, Louisa May Alcott and the Hospital Sketches, the entire thing is there for you to read and print out if you wish to do so. And then we have the ubiquitous lint. I don't know if you've ever heard of lint, women making rolling bandages and making lint, but one of the things that women did was to provide lint so that the wounds of the soldiers could be dressed. So women tore up their linen tablecloths, they tore up their linen sheets, they tore up everything they could that was linen, and then they made lint. And you make lint by,
And this is lint.
yes, you take out the transverse threads. So you can imagine how time-consuming and tedious this was, but when you have a group of 20 to 40 women sitting around and you're talking and you're all working, then it doesn't seem quite so bad. So if you'd like to try it, feel free. If you don't, that's okay too. But
It's almost like a gauze.
it is.
Yeah,
Yes.
my mother used to do, I mean, not that she was that old, but,
Mhm.
you know, more contemporary, do the same thing.
Really?
Directly refer to them as dressings.
Really?
And bring them to, you know, patients that had been discharged, that had wounds, and they needed fresh
Really?
dressings, yeah.
Rather than gauze or cotton.
Now, are you generally here for school tours?
I'm a volunteer.
So if there's a school tour, is it, and it's obviously scheduled, would you be here with an exhibit?
I work in an office with another person who is very pleased to have me come over at any time to do this.
Uh-huh.
So, yes, I
Okay.
would.
Good.
You're welcome.
Realize that no 12-year-old you've seen can fit into that uniform. And it's interesting to ask children, how did it happen that that boy was so much smaller than you are? And some of them came up with diet and others just get you get. The other thing that's interesting is that you had to be 18 to be in the Civil War. And over 18, so many people who wanted to go in the Civil War would write 18 on their shoe. And then when they asked them, are you over 18? They would say yes. And they would get to go in the war. Later on, some of them didn't want to go in the war. One way to get out would be knock your two front teeth out, because then you couldn't bite the tip off the bullet, the powder thing. And so that if there's so that. But this picture is a famous painting by actually a man who was a Confederate veteran who moved to New York and painted a picture of the 14th Brooklyn at Gettysburg on the first day at Gettysburg. And you'll notice that they're dressed with red pants and particular hats, because this was sort of involved with the Zouave movement that we talked about back there. But they were from Brooklyn, and they called themselves the 14th Brooklyn, even though the Army referred to them as the 84th, and the Confederates referred to them as those Red Lake Devils. So on the first day at Gettysburg, I'm going to talk a little bit about the terrain. One of the things you'll notice when you look at the map is there were many roads came into Gettysburg, that it was sort of a hub. And there were roads who came in from several directions. And Confederate troops were west, and some of them were northeast, headed up near Harrisburg. And what Lee wanted to do was to avoid, before all his troops came here, a battle. So he was waiting for his troops to come up. But during the first day, some of the Confederate troops went into Gettysburg because they thought there were shoes there. There were rumors that they could get shoes there, and many of them were barefoot. They didn't have any decent shoes. So they started into Gettysburg. At the same time, there was a Union cavalry unit under a man named Buford there, and the cavalrymen engaged the Confederates when they started coming into the town and slowed them down. In the meantime, the main army was coming up from the south towards Gettysburg. And in the afternoon, one of the corps arrived under a man named Reynolds, was one of the best generals in the Army of the Potomac. And he came up and helped relieve the cavalry. Now notice that this position here is like a fish hook. And what this is the critical terrain that was here. The Union lines after the first day, when they were chased back through the town back to here, but they were able to hold these positions. And there was an unfinished railroad caught here. And this is where this battle took place, when the Union troops first encountered the Confederate troops. This is a good example of the kind of how close they could be at times and how dangerous it could be just to be there. And they were shooting at one another. Eventually, they drove the Confederates back. But then the troops were driven back through town, and they ended up late that day, the first day of Gettysburg, here. Now this is like a fish hook, and this is called hill here, so this is high ground. And then there was more high ground over here, and a Cemetery Hill. And then there was a ridge here called Cemetery Ridge. Now, the advantage that this position provided to the Union Army was that they could move troops from in any of this area without having to expose them directly to fire from the Confederate Army. So they had interior lines of communication. And that allowed them holding this high ground, which you've seen probably the famous movie. Did you see the movie on Gettysburg that had the group from Maine up there?
I didn't see it.
Okay, well, Joshua Reynolds became famous for this. He had the troops from Maine kept the Confederates from coming up onto Little Round Top. And actually, he got much credit for that, but on the other hand, it was a New York unit that got up there.
That was Chamberlain, Joshua
Chamberlain, Joshua Chamberlain, I'm sorry, Joshua Chamberlain. And New York unit got up there. They also put a couple of cannon up there to help them out. But anyway, the Union Army was lined up along here. And Lee was in Pennsylvania, basically, strategically, to inflict a significant defeat on the Union Army in the hopes that prior to the coming election, the Northern people would become discouraged with the course of the war, which they really thought would be shortly over, and sue for peace, and would be willing to negotiate for peace. And the main problem for the Union Army was to keep them from getting to Washington, D.C. So they were trying to keep themselves between the Confederates and Washington, D.C. So just a strategic thing. There was disagreement in Lee's command over what would be the best thing to do. Lee wanted to attack Longstreet, who was his next most significant officer. With the death of Stonewall Jackson, Longstreet became the next significant officer and was a close associate of Lee. But he differed on the strategy. He wanted to move to the south and try to get between the Union Army and Washington and bring about an engagement where they would be on the defensive and not on the attack. But Lee disagreed with that, so he waited for his troops to come up. And then on the second day of Gettysburg, they made attacks here and here to try to drive the Union off, get through into the Union lines or drive them back and start them retreat. But it didn't work because, number one, remember in those days it's large masses of men but no communication. And besides, Lee never gave very good orders. He never gave direct orders. He would sort of tell his men what one thought they would do, but he didn't necessarily insist that they do what he told them to do. But anyway, the attacks on the second day were somewhat disjointed. They attacked up here, and the Union Army held. They attacked down here, and they were held down there. So at the end of the second day, they all went back, pulled back, and prepared for the day which led to the famous charge across there. And of course, they control a ridge here, but there are two problems. One is you have a huge supply problem. And the Confederates didn't have a very large quantity of ammunition with them, because all that ammunition had to be brought up with them on their wagons, and the wagons had been used up quite a bit, so that Lee planned a big artillery barrage, you know, before he attacked on when they made Pickett's charge, but they didn't have enough guns to really do a very good job of it. So, and there was supposed to be simultaneous attacks here and here, but this one went off before this one got off, so that when they came charging across here, it was able to move troops from up here down here to reinforce the line at a critical time. And also, the main 20th Maine was persuaded to go back into battle. Now some of these men, they actually didn't want to fight because they were 22-year men, and their 2-year enlistments were up. And this is what's been happening to the Union Army all the way up, as a matter of fact, from Washington, is all the 2-year enlistees were leaving and going home. And one of those regiments was the 26th New York, in which my great-grandfather was a member, and he was wounded at Gettysburg. But when they got 2 years were up, they came home. And some of them went into other units, but a lot of them just came home. So what was happening to Meade's army is that he was losing people on the way, but he was also getting people who were coming in to replace the ones that were leaving. So there was constant turnover here. But anyway, they did succeed in holding this position. So it shows you that the terrain is very important. They picked out a position here and were able to hold the strong points. And unless the Confederates could succeed in breaking through that, they could not defeat them and drive them back. Now, after the famous Pickett's charge, and by the way, Pickett got all of the credit for that charge because the Richmond papers printed the story of Gettysburg. And on the other hand, there were many North Carolina units who suffered just as badly, and they were up on the what would be their left flank of the Confederate things, and they were pretty well shot, but they got very little credit for being at Gettysburg, even though they took many casualties. Now, it's rather interesting that a lot of attention is focused on Gettysburg because it was a battle in the north, and there was a big battle and many years ago. But a very significant thing happened on the 3rd of July that was probably equally as important as far as the course of the war was concerned, and that is that Vicksburg, Mississippi, fell to Grant, and that cut the Confederacy down the Mississippi Valley, so that now the whole Mississippi Valley was controlled by the Union, and they had no communication with Texas or any place like that. So that was also one of two. So two important things happened. Lee did not succeed in defeating the Union Army, and Vicksburg fell, and everybody thought maybe the war could come to an end that shortly, but it didn't. Of course, it went on until 1865. The other thing is that Lincoln was very disturbed and upset because he wanted Meade to attack Lee before he could get across the Potomac River, but he didn't succeed in doing that. Mainly because war fought this way left the units pretty well banged up after they were fought in one of these battles. And the other thing is that he didn't let his cavalry loose, and he didn't feel he could go after them and get them. But it was very upsetting to Lincoln because his idea was that the way to win the war, you had to defeat, not capture territory, but destroy the military, the army. Do you have any questions? Now, I don't know what you would bring children to see.
Well, I mean, the artifacts,
Yeah.
we don't get into a lot of Civil War, but you know, that certain kid, a lot of kids are just interested in wars. And they know a lot about the industrial, the revolution.
I have a little boy in here with his parent. I'm a docent, so I was on duty, and he came in here with his parent, and he was telling his father what all his weapons were. He was a 10-year-old. He knew as much about this stuff as I did know.
That's what kids
So was fascinating to me. See,
Sure.
I'm amazed at the number of children and parents have been dragged in there by their kids to see the judge.
Well, that's a good thing. Yeah, great.
Well, thank you.
What we do are videotape interviews with veterans. And for the classroom, if you want to do oral history, we could show you how to do interviews, etc. I have a card if you... this is basically these are a compilation of some of the interviews we've done. This gentleman's from Manhattan. He was with the 8th Air Force. And, we could either let you use some videos for classroom use, or I could get you some veterans to come in to talk to your classes, or, we could come in, I could come in and show you, talk to you about how to do interviews. When I did 6th grade, I always had the kids do an interview. We had a local writer that did screenplays for the Tales of the Crypt. So she used to do these dark side stuff, and the kids used to love her coming in. And then I'd have them do, an interview with someone at home or something, not a videotape, but a written interview. But what we do are videotape interviews, and we have a little over 900 in our collection now. There was just a World War I veteran that we've done that's on here.
So on that first
We
mission, you
have,
get
I think, only done one of a
understand
present call
the
for
power
the
that is
Iraqi
basically
War.
there, and it really
I do have,
is overwhelming. It makes you feel terrific, because all of a sudden, there's a big fight war going on in the
we have
roadway.
some high schools partnership with us, and this was done by Rome, New York. It fits the program into the great standards that everyone knows so much about. So it talks about the standards a little bit. Inside of it, it also does
From then you work your way through the clouds and come up
how to do some interviews and so on.
an airplane with
So
a big
it
yellow
does that
body
inside
on it.
there.
Usually zebra stripes, which tells you that's the
Fifth
plane you're
grade,
gonna form on. It doesn't fly with
maybe to
It
do
just
an
circles
interview
up here
of
until your
a
formation, and all of you
parent
get
or
into formation
grandparent.
ready to go. And then
Some of the
you're on your
military
way.
ones that have to have a little knowledge.
And this sense of power on your first mission is
if they want to
really
do
is
anything in
overwhelming. You have every
detail at
reason
all.
to have been happy
I
that
also
you made this
have-
decision, and that you're in a bomber, and you've got all these other hundreds and hundreds of bombers
This
with
is
you.
from the
And then
Library of Congress program, and it talks a little bit about doing
usually those days
oral
last
history.
with you for maybe 50 to 100
These are
miles
student
away.
lessons, and talks to you about doing the program.
They run out of gas,
We're doing
they
oral
have to come
history.
back, and there is no air cover, and that's when the German Luftwaffe, the German fighters.
A little, mostly I think this is aimed for older students, but you
Then you
can
begin to see the
adapt it
losses
to
of your
your
power
own
because
years.
you see it. You see airplanes on either side of you,
So-
being shot, being on fire, going down.
Pardon me?
Or you yourself experience
Oh.
that. Fortunately, we did not on that first mission. We did not experience any firepower that hit us directly. But I did see planes
Yeah, this gives you some
going down that were in formation.
hints on how to
So the mission was
interview
long.
in there, so
The mission was successful.
maybe you could
We
use
hit the target.
those.
Everything worked.
Um,
We came back.
Ours are mostly made in military. We do military. We do some civilians that were in defense industries. There's a woman in Cambridge that was a Rosie the Riveter
The
at
letdown
Grumman
is
Aircraft
tremendous.
in Long
There really
Island.
isn't much to
And,
look forward to except doing it again.
we just
You
did some
really don't want
women
to do it
that
again.
are from the Syracuse area
You
that
wanted to
were
do it, you experienced
with
it, and
Bendix,
that's
so they
terrific.
made magnetic needles for
But to have
airplanes
to do
and
it
so on.
another
So,
24 times.
and some that were in the
Knowing what you
atomic
see
program,
is not
so Los
something you really
Alamos
do
and the
on a
Manhattan
normal
Project.
So in between missions,
Locally, you probably have people that are involved with nuclear
you're at
submarines
death's door,
and
and the next
with Wilton and
night,
so on. So.
you're down at a British pub.
Can
drinking
teachers
yourself silly 'cause you're not
specify
gonna have to find
particular
anything.
topics that they want to?
We would go into the collection and,
Okay.
and get
So if
things
we
out
wanted
of
to
it.
From that
see
experience, you
women,
learn
for example,
maybe today is
who have been
the day
in
you're going to live.
some
Today
aspect
is the day
of
you're going to die.
the military.
Yes, we have
Most
some
people
very good interviews of some
Frank
women
left when they
who
weren't flying.
were
And so it became pretty much a way of
a
life.
couple
in the
that were
airport.
in
People were
the
not-
first Gulf War that are very
I won't bore you
good.
with the other missions, but we did make the first three missions.
Some that were in
Berlin,
World War
and March
II,
6, 1944
Korea,
was referred to as Bloody
some
Monday
that were in
because we
defense
sent 600
industries,
airplanes out,
as I said,
and
nurses,
69 did not
wax,
come back.
yeah. So yes, you could, if you want to request an interview, we could copy it for you.
Our group was not basically.
Is that something that we could come here and watch that particular interview, or would it?
Yes, you could do that.
But on my ace
Yeah.
mission,
We're moving the collection that's in the basement area where the library is, with Jim talked to you about research. We're moving it up to our floor, which is the 3rd floor, just because he's running out of space and we need more space
we were going through
because
this.
of all the interviews
Let's
we're
tell you a little
doing.
bit about flag.
So if you, like I gave you my card, if you call ahead,
Ever since, because this is what flag looks like.
we would have to,
This is
we
a
would
piece of a
go
German
from, we do them on mini DVs. We would
88
change them
artillery
to
shell, which is
VHS, so
fired
you
from the
could
ground,
look at it
explodes at
and
25,000 feet
possibly
where
use
we
it
were.
in the classroom
About
in that
25,000.
format.
And it's a shell like this, about this
So,
long, and it's timed to explode and
I
destroy
don't know if
the
you have any
engines or the
questions.
airplane.
If you want like me to come
But
over, I
on my
could
eighth mission,
do
just
something
after
with
we
your
were going
class
through
about how to
this
interview
field of
and
flag where you can see these
some
flag
basic
clouds,
questions and things to look at, and it wouldn't necessarily be
actually pinpointing
military.
trajectory,
So,
just as we hit the target.
yeah.
The bombardier released the bomb.
Surrender was Eli Parker, who was an Iroquois, Haudenosaunee, people of the Longhouse. He was a sachem from Western New York, had gone through college to become an engineer, and he didn't get a lot of work as an engineer because of being a Native American. But he was picked up by Grant as his secretary, and he is the one that wrote the surrender proceedings at Appomattox. It was interesting before when I was in here, the light was shining, the sun was on us, and the Confederates were in bright and the Union was in the dark side. Kind of interesting. But yeah, Parker was very prominent with Grant, and Lee took note of him, and I guess when he walked in, he first looked at him and saw that he had a dark complexion, and then realized he was a Native American rather than an African American. So, and Grant, of course, Grant has connections with the area, with Grant's Cottage, if you're familiar with that. And New York, of course, built the prison around it, and it's infinite wisdom. Okay.
Members of the museum staff, and the other half are volunteers with MHI. And as we began to put this project together, we did research, and we came across so many journals and diary items and books. Quite honestly, they're out of print. They're old editions, books just revering the role that women play. It was amazing what we discovered. When you leave today, you're going to see at the front of the building, next to the stairwell, a large framed item called the Sanitary Commission's certificate. And we discovered that the women, probably 2 to 3 days after the start of the Civil War, began to organize themselves and recognize that they would need to be responsible for providing food, providing medical supplies, anything that would be helpful to the war. It's just amazing to research or to find out how these women all the way across the United States began to organize what were called these fairs, sanitation fairs. And these locations got people together to look at what was needed and to collect the materials that would be delivered to the men at the front. It was absolutely phenomenal to see the role that they played. And in the research, I also found out that Harriet Tubman had actually had a significant role in one military maneuver. And then you think about the times that she put herself in harm's way. It's just daunting, the role that these women played. And we began to take a look and wonder if we wouldn't call it, would it be appropriate to refer to it as the Woman's War rather than the Civil War. And I hope, Marion, you can join us? I don't know if you would recognize Dr. Mary Walker.
You want me to start my program?
Yes.
Oh, okay. You know, they might like to sit down too. Wouldn't you like to? You've been standing up most of the morning. You don't want to sit there, and I can just move over in front.
I will take that invitation.
All right. Move that out of the way. I'm going to get out my
sprout anymore. So I'll put my glasses on.
Excuse me a second.
And let's talk about some women. The way I start, well, hello. This is a nice group you have here this morning. A wonderful group. Why, I feel right at home. Well, almost. Even when I was standing out in the hall, I did. And how pleased I was to hear. And then you say, oh, you're Dr. Mary Walker, the only woman who ever received the Congressional Medal of Honor. That's right. And here it is. I always wear it. And then you say, tell us about yourself. All right, I promise that I will very diligently try not to bore you. I'll follow the advice my grandfather gave me. He always said, begin at the beginning. And my beginning was in Oswego, New York, on November 26, 1832. My father was Alva Walker, a carpenter and a farmer, and my mother was Vesta Whitcomb Walker. And as I look back and think about my parents, I now realize that they were very wise. Even when I was quite young, they constantly talked to me about things that were going on around us in the world. They told me what was happening, and I was especially intrigued by their stories about West Point as it struggled to get going from 1802 until Major Sylvanus Thayer was appointed superintendent in 1877. Why, he set up schedules and programs which are still in force today. And now that I'm old enough to reminisce about my youth, I realize that my parents gave me the guidance and the self-assurance which enabled me to think in practical as well as creative ways. One other thing I must also mention. Something I was totally unaware of in my youth, but I fully recognize it now. In the 1840s in upstate New York, it was fertile intellectual ground for a progressive-minded young woman like me. I'm afraid I can't deny that. I went to common school in Oswego and then to Valley Seminary. In 1855, I got my first medical degree from Syracuse Medical College and my second one from Hygeia Therapeutic College in 1862. I married Dr. Albert Miller in 1855. We were divorced in 1869 and had no children. Now, let's talk about some really important things. I'm sure that each one of you has several ideas, several convictions which you've really developed over the years. Well, I'm no different. I have some ideas too. I guess it's where we live, how we live, and with whom we live, which influences the development of our strongly held beliefs. So, let me tell you about mine. My mother and even my grandmother were always saying to me, wow, you don't miss a trick. Why, they even described me like this to other people. And sometimes when I was very young, I felt self-conscious when they did that. But all my friends will tell you I soon got over that. But I didn't get over my penchant for watching and listening to everything I saw and heard. And here is what I became keenly aware of in my surroundings as I grew up. The women in the medical profession did not get the respect they earned. Women couldn't vote, and I was very perturbed that men made and enforced all the laws which women had to abide by. And one of the cultural aspects of our society which bothered me greatly was the impractical, unhealthy, and extremely restrictive nature of women's clothing. How on earth could any woman, young or old, function in a productive, enjoyable lifestyle, all gussied up in tight corsets, billowing petticoats, wide skirts, and a hat stuck on their head full of peacock feathers? Now, how could they function like that? So, somewhere along the line, I'm not exactly sure when, and I'm sure these ideas didn't hit me all of a sudden, but developed gradually, I vowed to work in every way I could to promote greater respect for women. And I firmly believe this was long overdue in all areas. At home, in the workplace, and in the professions, and of course, most especially in the medical profession. And another vow I made to myself was to get both men and women to understand the absolutely urgent need to reform women's clothing styles. And of course, as you can see, I became a prime role model for influencing that revision. Oh my goodness. I've rambled on and on here, haven't I? And you may be thinking, yeah, I thought she was going to talk about the Civil War. Well, strange as it may seem, every last word, every one of them, relates to the war. How? Well, like this. Women, thousands of women served and sacrificed during the war. How many women's names have you seen on honor rolls for the Civil War? How many award ceremonies have you seen scheduled to honor these women? How many women doctors, and yes, I admit there were a few, could treat patients in a more humane way than the customary process? I didn't believe that amputations were the only prescription for wounds. But I wasn't allowed to employ my methods. How many of the 400 women who actually served on active duty during the Civil War were ever promoted as the men were? This whole subject of respect for women, allowing women to achieve some measure of equality, and enabling them to become more than just window dressing for the men in our lives, has been a lifelong challenge for me. There were a few gains, I'll grant you that, but never enough to satisfy me that we as women had achieved anything nearly equal to our true potential. Have we reached our true potential now? Well, I think I'll let you work for the answer to that loaded question. And as I conclude, I'd like to share with you another aspect about the years 1861 to 1865. Suppose I had been able to visit all of the states involved in this cataclysmic event in our nation, which I didn't, of course. What would some of my thoughts have been? I would have thought there were many, many fine, principled, dedicated men and women in both the North and the South. That both men and women in all parts of the country gave great service and made great sacrifices. Some very long-held traditions were shaken to the core. And of course, some of them were completely destroyed. That there were almost no places in our country where women were truly respected, praised, or even thanked for their contributions. And had the women not mobilized and organized, the outcome of the Civil War could really have been totally different. And here is how they served. By 1860, 270,000 women worked in northern textile factories, 65% of the workforce. In the South, 12,000 women, 10%, worked outside their homes. Women in the South made Havelock apparel, flags, and regimental emblems. 20,000 aid societies were created in the North within 2 weeks of the outbreak of the Civil War. Dorothea Dix, who shared information about an assassination plot against President Lincoln, was noted for her nurses' training program. About 3,000 women served as nurses and dealt with the needs of soldiers, displaced whites and Negroes, widows and orphans, and indigent families. They also got news to families about wounded and dying soldiers.